The rain drummed against the cracked windows of their Brooklyn apartment, each drop sharp as if the sky itself were hammering nails into Daniel Carter's chest. Inside, the tiny kitchen smelled faintly of burnt coffee and damp plaster. The table was littered with receipts, a stack of unopened bills and the glow of a weary laptop screen. Daniel hunched forward, shoulders tense, eyes glued to the message that had just appeared. The deal was final. Carter Systems, the small software startup he had built through sleepless nights and borrowed time, had just closed its first major contract, $60 million. He read the number again and again, blinking as if the digits might rearrange themselves. This was it, the turning point. The key that would unlock the life he'd promised his wife when they were young and foolish, and believed love alone could fill the gaps left by empty bank accounts. For a moment he let himself imagine it, but a bigger apartment with working heat and a sliver of skyline instead of a graffiti-stained wall, a new couch, credit cards paid off, the trip to Italy Sophie once begged for. He could already hear her laugh, the one that once made him feel invincible. The front door slammed like a gunshot. Sophie's heels clattered against the linoleum, each step a countdown. Daniel minimized the screen. He wanted the deal to be a surprise, a redemption arc that wiped away years of disappointment. He turned words on his tongue. I did it. We made it. But Sophie didn't give him the chance. She stood in the doorway, knockoff trenchcoat dripping rainwater mascara streaked around eyes that burned not with fatigue but with contempt. A manila envelope bulged in her hand. She let it drop, thud rattling empty mugs. We need to talk, she said, voice clipped and cold. His pulse quickened. He glanced at the envelope, dread crawling through his veins. Sophie, wait. I have something to show you. Tonight's different. Everything is about to don't. She cut in, palm lifted. She sat opposite him, gaze sweeping the dingy apartment as if seeing it for the first or last time, peeling wallpaper, secondhand furniture, a broken radiator that wheezed without warmth. I can't do this anymore, Daniel. I can't pretend this is enough, that you're enough. The words sliced clean. He stared, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the girl from Colombia who laughed over dollar pizza and swore they'd conquer the world. What are you saying? I've wasted 7 years waiting for you to become someone, waiting for the life a real man provides. But you're not a real man, Daniel. You're a dreamer drowning in fantasies. She pushed the envelope toward him. Divorce papers. The bold letterhead screamed before he even opened it. Sophie, please, listen, I've been working for this every night, every weekend. Today, enough. I don't want excuses. I want results, and you failed. I refuse to sync with you. His hand trembled over the envelope. Beside him, the laptop glowed, the minimized contract waiting to be revealed, proof he wasn't what she believed. One click, one sentence, and her certainty would collapse. He didn't click. Pride, maybe, or the need to see how far she'd go. She rose, wet coat clinging, chin lifted with the arrogance of liberation. His name is Richard Morgan, she said, each syllable a blade. He's everything you're not: successful, driven, wealthy. He asked me to marry him. The room tilted. Richard Morgan. New York real estate, Park Avenue, penthouse business pages. She hadn't just given up, she'd replaced him. How long? 6 months. No hesitation, no shame. The rain hammered the glass, underscoring the brutality. She slid the envelope closer. Sign. Movers come tomorrow. Maybe this will motivate you to grow up. Her heels echoed away. The door slammed. Silence pooled. The envelope before him. The laptop beside him. One represented the end of what he thought was permanent, the other a fortune she would never see. He pressed his hands against his face, betrayal heavier than the storm. When he finally lifted his head, he scrawled his signature without reading. His hand shook not with fear but with resignation. Outside, rain poured on. Inside, the laptop's confirmation blinked like a cruel joke. He had won everything just as he lost it all. The apartment felt colder without Sophie, though the radiator rattled in protest as if trying to fill the void she'd left. Daniel sat long after the slam of the door, faded, staring at the signed papers. His pen lay beside the envelope like a weapon that had fired its last shot. He should have told her. He should have shouted it at her retreating back, but the words wedged in his throat. He chose silence and let the storm outside echo the one inside. Hours later, keys turned in the lock. His heart leapt. Maybe she'd changed her mind. The door opened. Sophie entered with the same disdain, mascara-cleaned trench replaced by a silk blouse that caught the dim light. She carried herself like someone who'd already stepped into another life. "Forgot something?" he asked flat. She set her phone on the counter. A text flashed Richard. She smirked. "You deserve the truth. Richard Morgan isn't a fling. He's the man I'm going to marry." He forced his breath steady. Everyone knew the name. Covers, champagne without price tags, the kind of man Sophie wanted. "He's everything you're not," she continued. "He doesn't chase pipe dreams. He builds empires. He delivers. He gives me the life I deserve." "How long?" he asked, voice low. 6 months, brutal honesty delivered like a weather report. He rose slowly, shadow stretching across the kitchen. "So while I worked 18-hour days to build something from nothing, you built an escape plan. You never noticed," she said. "You were buried in your laptop in fantasies and didn't see me slipping away." She crossed the room. "Paris next week. First class, the Ritz, the Seine. The life you promised, but never delivered." Something broke, not his love, which had been dying, but his faith in what they'd built. He wanted to scream about the contract that made him wealthier overnight than Richard imagined. Instead, he stayed silent. His silence, he realized, was a weapon. She mistook it for defeat. "You'll thank me someday," she said, collecting her things. "Maybe this will push you to stop dreaming and start acting like a man." The door clicked shut, almost tender, mocking the violence of her words. Daniel unminimized the screen. The Harris Global deal wasn't fantasy. 60 million, a foundation that would grow. She had chosen her path blind to what she abandoned. He exhaled a bitter smile, tugging. Let her have Paris. Let her have Richard. By the time she returned, the world would know his name. And when she realized what she'd thrown away, it would be too late. Winter melted into spring, and with it Daniel shed the last remnants of the man Sophie had left. He rose before dawn, worked long after midnight. Carter Systems, once a dream scribbled on napkins and coded on a second-hand laptop, took shape glass-walled office downtown. Steel beams, the hum of servers. He hired a lean team of engineers and visionaries who believed. Shared desks, bad coffee, electric air. Every day the weight of failure slid off, replaced by momentum. Within 6 months, Carter Systems launched a platform that reimagined financial security. Banks noticed, investors lined up, skepticism evaporated under the numbers. The press called Daniel a rising star, a disruptor, the quiet genius from Brooklyn. He let the numbers speak. Sophie paraded a new life, online rooftop dinners with Richard Morgan selfies under the Eiffel Tower, Milan sprees. Diamonds she once begged Daniel to buy now dangled easily. Captions dripped. "Finally living the life I deserve." Friends envied. Family congratulated. She didn't know the man she mocked was becoming a ghost haunting her perfect photos. Sometimes late, Daniel saw her posts. He never liked, never commented, never blocked. He scrolled past. Silence was sweeter than any argument. By year's end, Carter Systems neared a 200 million valuation. Wall Street Journal ran his photo, the engineer who outsmarted Wall Street. Sharp suit, steady eyes, a far cry from the man who'd signed divorce papers with trembling hands. He kept the paper folded in his desk, not for vanity but as a reminder. Pain can be fuel, betrayal, a blueprint. Across town, cracks formed in Richard's empire, a stalled Miami Tower, zoning fights in Chicago. Daniel's analysts tracked every tremor. Empires built on arrogance collapse. Sophie didn't see. She was busy posting Hamptons parties and yacht champagne. Daniel didn't begrudge her. She had chosen. While she flaunted borrowed wealth, he built unshakable power. One night in his new penthouse, the East River spread beneath, he raised a glass to the lights. "This is only the beginning," he whispered, and for the first time in years believed it. Summer settled over Manhattan. Daniel moved through the 40th floor near Bryant Park with quiet authority. Carter Systems' platform spread across U.S. banking. Breaches dropped, fraud slashed, billions saved. Journalists begged for interviews. He gave few, measured and assured. Whispers trailed him at galas. "That's Carter. The one his wife left. Look at him now." He heard but didn't feed on it. Validation had shifted inward. Sophie took Richard's last name early. Her feed glowed infinity pools. Paris rooftops, Milan boutiques, finally living the life I was meant for. Envy and hearts-filled comments, but a restlessness gnawed. Richard's attention fragmented, calls through dinners, emails on vacations, appearances over intimacy. She told herself she had chosen right. Cracks widened. A New York Times headline froze her at the kitchen counter. Carter Systems secures landmark European deal. Daniel stepping from a car in London-tailored coat, sharp in fog, a small, certain smile. Richard muttered, "He'll burn out." Markets disagreed. Valuations surged past $500 million. European banks signed. Asia, called Silicon Valley, leaned in. Analysts labeled Carter Systems a serious long-term threat. Meanwhile, Morgan contracts bled out to Daniel's sleeker platform. Richard snapped in boardrooms. Sophie doubled down online. Comments thinned. Invitations waned. Old friends drifted toward Daniel's orbit. Late at night, she lingered too long on his steady smile. Daniel didn't gloat. He worked and made space for a life. He met Isabella Martinez, a patent attorney with wit and steel. She teased his meticulous notes, challenged assumptions, treated him like a person, not a trophy. Bookstores in Brooklyn. Small cafes, childhood stories. With Isabella there was ease, something Sophie never understood. Peace is priceless. Sophie posed at galas, fewer eyes cared. Bankers whispered about Carter Systems' rise and Morgan Enterprises' decline. That night in mirrored walls, she saw doubt for the first time. Daniel visited his mother, Evelyn Carter, in Connecticut. Over tea, pride warmed her eyes. "You don't have to prove anything anymore," she said. "Just live." He looked at the calm garden and realized she was right. Success wasn't about proving Sophie wrong. It was about honoring himself and the peace he'd earned. The envelope arrived on a gray Wednesday cream stock, edged in gold, placed carefully beside merger contracts. Embossed names, Sophie Bennett and Richard Morgan. He let it sit heavy with memory, then opened it. "You are cordially invited to witness the marriage of Sophie Bennett and Richard Morgan at St. Patrick's Cathedral, June 12th. A handwritten note curved with old arrogance. "No hard feelings, Daniel. Come see what a real wedding looks like. Maybe you'll finally understand what success means." He leaned back, skyline blazing behind the glass. Outside, phones buzzed and analysts paced, but inside his head there was stillness. Sophie thought she'd sent a victory notice. She had, in truth, summoned a reckoning. He lifted his bourbon light, catching amber, and almost smiled. She believed he was still the man who signed without a word. She had no idea how far he'd risen. He pressed the intercom. "Victor, prepare the convoy for Saturday. Full security detail." Across the city, Sophie choreographed coronation. Vera Wang gown, Italian roses, a string quartet rehearsing beneath vaulted ceilings. The guest list glistened: politicians, media, social elites. She told herself this would silence doubts. Richard played confident while pressure gnawed. Projects faltered, lawsuits mounted, shareholders grumbled. "New money burns bright and burns out fast," he told Sophie. "Carter won't last." She laughed thinly. Unease flickering whenever Daniel's face appeared beside headlines that called him the future of finance. At rehearsal, Sophie walked the aisle, lace whispering over marble. She tried to imagine awe, but saw Daniel in the pews, calm, unreadable. She banished the vision. This was her day. In his penthouse, Daniel reviewed another folder while the invitation slid back into a drawer. Not just stock certificates, a lattice of SPVs, proxy trusts, total return swaps, and pre-arranged voting agreements, a controlling voting bloc aligned with him in Morgan Enterprises. Legal, discreet, devastating. By the time Sophie walked the aisle, Richard's footing would already be compromised. Manhattan glowed against dusk. He thought of her parting words, pathetic nothing. Once they carved him open. Now they were noise. He raised his glass. "Let her have her spectacle," he murmured. "The real story begins when I arrive." Saturday was 3 days away. The bells of St. Patrick's Cathedral rang over Fifth Avenue with solemn grandeur. Black SUVs lined the curb-tinted windows, hiding the powerful and pretentious. Incense tangled with perfume beneath Gothic arches. Lilies cascaded in white. New York's elite murmured in polished pews. This wasn't a wedding. It was theater. Sophie, soon to be Sophie Morgan, stood crowned in pearl silk, trailing like a comet. "They'll see I was right," she whispered to her reflection. At the altar, Richard waited in a perfect tuxedo. His groomsmen executives like dark sentinels. A row of directors sat behind them. This wasn't just union. It was merger. The cathedral stirred, not for Sophie still upstairs, but for the unexpected guest. The first SUV released precision angling security. The second, more earpieces. The third opened, and Daniel stepped out. No longer the weary founder hunched over a laptop. He was transformed, charcoal Armani silk tie, polished shoes. a platinum watch winking in stained glass light. Conversation snapped off. Heads turned. Cameras fluttered. Daniel Carter Forbes cover. He's the one who outmaneuvered Morgan's last bid. Richard's smile faltered. Upstairs, Sophie's maid of honor yanked a curtain. Sophie froze at the window. The man she'd abandoned moved with effortless authority, serenity set deep in his eyes. "This can't be real," she whispered. The organ thundered. Sophie took her father's arm. But as she entered, attention wavered eyes flicked past her to the front pew, where Daniel sat, posture straight, expression unreadable. Monsignor Harper presided at the altar, voice rolling like distant surf. Richard began his vows. His voice trembled. Directors fidgeted, phones glowing under pews as a Time press release hit Carter. Systems announces a landmark partnership. Morgan Enterprises faces immediate contract migration risk. Markets reacted. Morgan stock slid into a steep double-digit drop. The timing was merciless. When Sophie spoke, the practiced lines scattered. The diamond on her hand felt heavy. Applause landed polite and thin. At the Grand Metropolitan Hotel reception, the narrative betrayed them fully. Guests swarmed Daniel. CEOs, toasted bankers pitched. The mayor shook his hand. Richard watched, scotch clutched as influence shifted handshake by handshake. On the balcony, city lights glittered like unreachable stars. Sophie found Daniel. "I was wrong," she whispered, makeup cracking. "About you, about everything. Can we start over?" He studied her, remembering a girl who once believed love could conquer a cheap queen's night. That girl was gone, replaced by someone who bartered loyalty for luxury. "I did love you once, Sophie," he said softly. "But I love my peace more." He brushed past. Laughter from the ballroom rose behind her, but none of it belonged to her now. She stared out at the city she thought she owned and felt for the first time profoundly alone. Morning brought heat that clung to Manhattan like a damp veil. Inside, Morgan Enterprises air conditioning purred over a room gone tense. Directors lined the board table, jaws tight, screens bleeding red. Overnight notes from lenders, client defections, a dozen urgent emails from regulators. "Carter's platform is eating our book," an executive said. "Security, latency, compliance. He's leapfrogged us." Richard slammed a fist against polished wood. "He's a lucky coder with a headline cycle. I built empires from scratch. I'll outlast him." His phone buzzed, another investor demanding a call. The press turned. "Quiet coup in finance security," read one column. "Morgan's moat springs a leak," read another. Analysts replayed the Cathedral Day press release like a slow-motion replay of a knockout. Morgan's PR offered bravado. Markets shrugged. At home, the gloss dulled. Sophie's caption still sparkled, "Opera Cipriani, a borrowed yacht," but engagement thinned. DM threads went silent. At brunch, an old friend's eyebrow arched when Morgan's stock came up. The question hovered. Had she traded conviction for chandeliers? Nights stretched long. Richard stayed out later, returning with the blunt musk of whiskey and some stranger's perfume. When she finally asked, "Were you with her?" he didn't flinch. "Don't be naive, Sophie. Power attracts power. You wanted this life, remember?" The words landed with the same dismissiveness she once used on Daniel, and for the first time she felt how it cut. Daniel, meanwhile, kept building. He closed an acqui-hire of a struggling San Jose cybersecurity team by Wednesday. By Friday, their detection engine was shipping an alpha. In a glass room overlooking the skyline, he told his team, "We're not just selling software, we're selling trust. It's the only currency that compounds forever." Heads nodded. People believed him because he spoke like a man who knew the cost of losing it. At week's end, 3 banks publicly migrated to Carter systems. Morgan's board scheduled an emergency session. A hedge fund that once backed Richard privately called Daniel's office. Through SPVs, proxy trusts, and voting agreements, a scattered coalition quietly aligned behind Carter's vision. Sophie scrolled, late thumb pausing over a photo. Daniel in a navy suit, eyes lit by a joke from Isabella Martinez, who stood beside him with unstudied ease. No stagecraft, no chandeliers, just 2 people comfortable in their skin. Sophie locked her phone and stared at the ceiling, hearing only the apartment's hollow silence. The following Monday, Richard entered the boardroom to find seats already filled, conversations already begun without him. A director cleared his throat. "For the good of the company, Richard, we need a transition plan." In the glass reflection, Richard saw a man who had mistaken noise for strategy. He straightened his cuffs. "You're making a mistake," he said, but the room had moved on. Across town, Daniel stepped out of an elevator into morning sun. He bought a coffee, didn't check his phone, and walked 3 extra blocks just to feel the city breathe. For the first time since the rain in Brooklyn, the air felt light. The Caribbean sun burned like molten gold as the cruise ship pulled away. A band played Fly Me to the Moon, champagne flutes chimed, cameras clicked. Richard had purchased spectacle. He believed luxury was a fortress against doubt. Sophie smiled for photos while something inside unraveled. Daniel's sentence haunted her. I love my peace more. Peace, the one thing she'd never been able to buy. The week unfolded like a magazine spread. Suites, buffets, candlelit decks, but each moment felt scripted. Richard barked into Bluetooth about a company slipping through his fingers. At night, he collapsed, leaving Sophie alone with the slow churn of ceiling fans and regret. Back in New York, Daniel wasn't thinking of Sophie. His calendar was a cadence of labs, boardrooms, and quiet dinners, where Isabella challenged him with law logic and laughter. At a Boston fundraiser, he arrived without theatrics, just a man in a navy suit holding a woman's hand. The room orbited naturally, not hungrily. Respect is quieter than envy. It also lasts longer. Sophie's curated life began to fracture. Receipts she hadn't generated, hotel bills she hadn't signed. This is how men like me live, Richard said. Don't ask questions you don't want answered. She tasted the metallic edge of a truth she once refused to see. In a bookstore window on a rain-polished street, the old man and the sea stared back at her weathered perseverance on a paperback cover. She whispered, I thought I was chasing a bigger life. Maybe I was running from myself. A message arrived from Daniel. Not a plea, not a gloat. I hope you find what you were looking for, Sophie. No anger, just distance. Her knees went weak. She hadn't only lost his love, she'd lost his respect. That was the wound that didn't bleed but never closed. By autumn, Morgan Enterprises was sold off in pieces. Directors who had toasted Richard now lined up outside Daniel's office. Richard raged, threatened suits, drowned ego in whiskey. One evening, Sophie returned to the penthouse to find her suitcases waiting. Richard didn't raise his voice. You wanted a king, he said. Turns out I'm not. And you're a passenger who bought the wrong ticket. He turned away already on another call. She dragged her suitcase into a small rental where paint peeled and bulbs flickered eerily familiar, except there was no pot of pasta on the stove, no hopeful smile at the table. Weeks later, she saw Daniel and Isabella walking Madison Avenue laughing softly. No designer bag, no entourage. A glow money can't counterfeit. Sophie stood frozen with a boutique bag she could no longer afford and learned how silence can be louder than beggars' prayers. In his penthouse, the first snow drifted past the windows. Daniel stood with his mother Evelyn as she signed the last documents returning everything fully to his name. She squeezed his hand. You did it, son. I didn't need to prove it to her, he said. I needed to prove it to myself. That night at a winter gala, people turned not with pity, not with curiosity, but with respect. Daniel smiled, not the bitter curve of revenge, but the calm line of a man who had finally found freedom. Across the river, Sophie sat alone, scrolling old photos. One showed 2 kids at a street fair, paper cups of coffee faces lit with laughter. Her fingertip traced the glass. I traded a diamond for dust, she whispered. The city answered with the same sound it always makes when a lesson is finally learned, nothing at all. Winter's chill sharpened Manhattan's skyline, each tower gleaming like a blade against the gray sky. Newspapers screamed what boardrooms already knew: Morgan Enterprises had collapsed. Once an untouchable empire, it now unraveled in lawsuits, investigations, and shareholder revolts. Attorneys circled like vultures, regulators summoned hearings, and Richard Morgan's name, once synonymous with invincibility, became shorthand for hubris. Daniel Carter read the headlines over black coffee unshaken. He hadn't set out to destroy Morgan, not directly, but competition, when met with arrogance, had done the work for him. Carter Systems' innovations exposed Morgan's weaknesses. Richard's downfall was his own refusal to adapt. Still, Daniel instructed his legal team to tread carefully. He wanted growth, not blood. We don't gloat, he reminded them. We deliver. Meanwhile, Richard faced a storm no tailored suit could deflect. Federal subpoenas landed at his penthouse. Shareholders filed class actions. Projects in Chicago and Miami became case studies in mismanagement. Photographers hounded him on courthouse steps, flashing bulbs catching the sweat on his temple. The swagger was gone. In its place, a man cornered by his own empire's rubble. Sophie Morgan, once Bennett watched it unfold from the sidelines, her name tied by marriage to a scandal she hadn't built but couldn't escape. Invitations vanished, brand deals evaporated, former friends unfollowed. Even her curated Instagram, once flooded with envy, now filled with venom. Gold digger. Should have stayed with Carter. Karma. She deleted comments at midnight, tears smudging the glow of her screen. But Sophie's punishment was deeper than public scorn. It was private silence. Richard rarely came home, and when he did, it was with lawyers or with liquor. One evening, after another day of headlines about asset freezes, he spat the words she feared. "You wanted wealth. Here's what it looks like when it burns." Then he slammed the door, leaving her alone with echoes. Across the river, Daniel's world expanded. Carter Systems opened its London office in Canary Wharf, a sleek hub overlooking the Thames. In Singapore, a ribbon-cutting ceremony drew ministers and bankers alike. His software now ran beneath the surface of transactions across 3 continents. Analysts stopped calling him the Brooklyn Disruptor and began calling him the architect of a new financial order. At each launch, Isabella Martinez stood at his side not as a trophy but as counsel and partner. She negotiated patents with ferocity, whispered strategy, before press briefings steadied him in quiet moments. To the world, they were a power couple. To Daniel, she was a mirror reflecting not who he had been, but who he had become. Yet success brought shadows. Congressional committees sent inquiries about Carter Systems' growing influence. Rivals whispered antitrust. Daniel prepared building a compliance arm robust enough to silence skeptics. He had learned true empires are built not just on innovation, but on resilience. One night in Geneva, after signing a deal with the European Central Bank, Daniel stood on a hotel balcony overlooking the lake. Snow fell softly, muffling the city below. Isabella joined him, draping a shawl over her shoulders. "You know they'll come for you now," she said. "When you grow this fast, enemies multiply." Daniel nodded, eyes on the distant Alps. "Let them come. We're not hiding." His voice carried the weight of a man who had once lost everything and discovered that survival itself was power. Back in New York, Sophie reached a breaking point. The penthouse she once flaunted was now stripped of luxury art, repossessed cars, seized staff gone. She found herself cooking pasta in silence, the scent eerily familiar of another life. On a desperate impulse, she called Daniel's office. The assistant's voice was polite but firm. "Mr. Carter doesn't take unscheduled calls," but Daniel heard about it later. Victor mentioned her name with professional neutrality. Daniel only said, "Noted," nothing more. He felt no anger, only distance, like hearing of a city he once lived in but no longer belonged to. Weeks later, Sophie stood in the back of a Manhattan courtroom as Richard faced charges of fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Reporters swarmed the hallway. Flashes lit her face, though she tried to hide behind sunglasses. Richard barely looked at her when he entered, his cuffed wrists, the final punctuation of a fall. Sophie left before the verdict, the echo of the gavel following her down the marble steps. That night she wrote Daniel a letter, not an email, not a text, but ink on paper. She apologized for everything, for choosing arrogance over loyalty, for mocking his dreams, for failing to see the man he was becoming. She didn't ask for reconciliation, only forgiveness. She sealed it, but never mailed it. The envelope sat on her nightstand for weeks, then months, until dust gathered on its corners. Daniel, meanwhile, was already elsewhere, literally and figuratively. He sat in a boardroom in Tokyo, sunlight streaming through shoji screens, executives bowing as they signed the partnership papers. Carter Systems was no longer a company, it was an institution. And Daniel, once a man signing divorce papers with trembling hands, now signed agreements that reshaped global finance. Late that evening, Isabella teased him as they walked through Shinjuku's neon streets. "Do you ever think about what she would say now if she saw all this?" Daniel paused, neon reflecting in his eyes. "She has her ghosts. I have my peace. That's enough." They crossed the street as the city pulsed around them, 2 figures moving forward, unchained by the past. Back in New York, Sophie finally mailed the letter. By then, Daniel was already in another country, another deal, another life. When the envelope arrived at his office, Victor placed it in the personal tray. Daniel saw her name, rested a hand on it for a moment, then slid it into a drawer without opening it. Some doors, he knew, must remain closed. The snow fell again on Manhattan, dusting the skyline in white. Daniel Carter stood at the window of his penthouse, glass in hand, the city glowing like embers below. He was no longer a man chasing validation. He was the storm others measured themselves against. And in the silence, he found what Sophie never could piece, that no fortune could buy. Spring sunlight flooded the glass towers of Midtown. But for Daniel Carter, the glow came with shadows. Carter systems had become indispensable. Banks, governments, corporations all relied on his software. With dominance came suspicion. Senators called hearings in Washington. Headlines asked, "Has Carter built a digital monopoly?" Antitrust lawyers sharpened their knives. Rivals funded smear campaigns whispering of vulnerabilities that didn't exist. Daniel flew to Capitol Hill, his tailored suit immaculate, his voice steady as he faced a panel of politicians hungry for spectacle. "Mr. Carter," one senator barked, "do you realize you control nearly half of global financial transactions?" Daniel leaned into the microphone. Calm, grounded. "Control is the wrong word, Senator. We secure them. If Carter systems vanished tomorrow, billions of people would lose protection. We don't own the future, we safeguard it." The hearing ended in applause from some, suspicion from others. Outside, cameras swarmed. A reporter shouted, "Are you the next Rockefeller or the next villain?" Daniel walked past in silence, Isabella at his side, her hand a quiet anchor. Yet pressure mounted. Regulators in Europe demanded audits. Asia raised concerns about sovereignty. His advisors urged retreat to slow down. But Daniel remembered the nights in Brooklyn, the rain, the envelope of divorce papers. He had built this empire brick by brick out of heartbreak and fire. He wasn't slowing down. Across the river, Sophie Morgan faced a different spring. Gone was the penthouse, gone. The invitations. She rented a one-bedroom walk-up in Queens, its peeling paint a mirror of the apartment she once scorned. She worked part-time at a boutique folding clothes she could no longer afford to buy. Customers rarely noticed her, but when they did, she smiled with a humility she hadn't known before. At night, she took classes at a community college, accounting, marketing, anything that might give her a chance to stand again. Her classmates were younger, hungrier, but Sophie sat in the back with determination. One professor paused once, recognizing her name from old headlines. She lowered her eyes. "That's not who I am anymore," she said softly. On weekends, she volunteered at a women's shelter, pouring coffee, listening to stories of loss and survival. In their resilience, she saw fragments of herself. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something raw, the need to build a self-worth for giving. Meanwhile, Carter Systems prepared for its boldest move, yet a global clearinghouse platform, a network that could replace outdated systems in dozens of countries. It promised faster, safer, cheaper finance. It also promised scrutiny like never before. At a board meeting, Isabella voiced what others hesitated to say. "If you launch this, you'll be at war with governments, not just corporations. Are you ready for that?" Daniel looked out the window. The city spread like a circuit board. "We don't pick the war, but we don't hide from it either." The room fell silent. They knew he wasn't chasing money anymore. He was chasing permanence. One evening, Daniel visited his mother Evelyn in Connecticut. She poured tea, her hands slower now, her eyes still sharp. "You're building something no one can ignore," she said. "But remember, Daniel, power that cannot bend will eventually break." He nodded, storing the words. He had once ignored her wisdom and lost everything. He wouldn't make that mistake twice. Sophie's path crossed Daniel's again by chance. She was exiting the community center where she tutored single mothers in basic bookkeeping. He was arriving for a quiet charity event, no cameras, no headlines. Their eyes met across the steps. For a heartbeat, time rewound graffiti-stained walls, cheap pizza promises made under starlight. Sophie clutched her worn bag tighter, afraid he'd see only the wreckage of who she had been. But Daniel's gaze held no contempt, no longing either, only recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of two lives diverged. "Daniel?" she whispered, unsure if he'd stop. He did. "Sophie." His voice was calm like the surface of a deep lake. I'm trying," she said, words trembling, "to be someone better." For the first time in years, his smile reached his eyes, not warm, not cold, simply human. "Then keep going," he said. "No promise of reconciliation, no door reopened, just a benediction light as spring air." Then he turned and walked inside, leaving her with tears she didn't hide. By summer, Carter Systems launched the clearinghouse platform. World leaders denounced, applauded, negotiated. Markets surged, trembled, adapted. Protesters gathered outside his offices. Supporters called him a visionary. Critics called him a threat. Daniel sat in his penthouse one night, reports stacked high. Isabella asleep in the next room. He poured bourbon, staring at the skyline. For years the lights had mocked him, now they were his canvas. Yet Evelyn's warning whispered in his mind, power that cannot bend will break. He exhaled slowly, the weight of empires pressing on his shoulders. He had become what Sophie once demanded, and more, wealthier, stronger, untouchable. Yet he wondered as the city hummed below if peace could survive the storm that was coming. Autumn winds swept down Fifth Avenue, rattling banners that bore Daniel Carter's face. To some, he was the savior of global finance. To others, a tyrant in a tailored suit. Protesters waved placards outside Carter Systems headquarters, "Break up the empire." No king in finance. Inside, Daniel sat across from a delegation of senators, ministers, and regulators. Cameras rolled, red lights glowing. This was not a hearing. This was a trial conducted in the court of public opinion. Mr. Carter, a European commissioner, said sharply, "Your clearinghouse gives you more influence than the IMF. Do you intend to rule global markets?" Daniel clasped his hands. Calm, deliberate. "We don't rule markets, we secure them. But I won't apologize for solving problems others ignored." A senator leaned forward. "The public thinks you're untouchable. Too big, too fast, too dangerous. Why should governments trust you?" Daniel met their eyes one by one. Because governments built systems that failed. Banks bled billions. Ordinary people lost homes. We offer resilience. Trust isn't given, it's earned. We'll keep earning it, the chamber murmured. Reporters scribbled. Some nodded, others scowled. The verdict was far from settled. That night, Daniel walked out of the tower into cold air, bodyguards flanking him. Isabella joined him, her hand brushing his sleeve. "They want to break you," she said quietly. He looked up at the city lights, harsh and brilliant. "Then they'll have to try harder." But when he returned home, Evelyn's words echoed again. "Power that cannot bend will break." Sophie Morgan sat in a Queen's classroom, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She had just finished presenting a project for her marketing class, how to rebuild trust in a damaged brand. Her professor lingered, after eyes thoughtful. "You know," he said, "with your experience, you should consider non-profit work. People would listen if you spoke honestly about what you've seen." That night, Sophie lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling. Non-profit. Honest. The word struck deeper than she expected. She thought of the women at the shelter, of their raw gratitude for someone simply pouring coffee without judgment. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of purpose. Weeks later, Daniel stood in Geneva, flanked by lawyers facing a tribunal of world regulators. The air was tense, translations murmured in headsets, cameras whirring. His rivals had lobbied hard. Break up Carter Systems, let its power shackle its influence. Daniel rose, voice steady. "You fear concentration of power. I understand. But ask yourselves, would you rather global finance rest on the arrogance of men like Richard Morgan, or on systems designed to prevent collapse? This is not about control. It's about trust. And we will submit to oversight audits, transparency, not because we're weak, but because we're strong enough to prove ourselves." The room shifted. His offer of bending of oversight landed where defiance would have sparked war. Regulators exchanged glances. It wasn't victory yet, but it was survival. In New York, Sophie volunteered to speak at a community event on rebuilding after financial ruin. She stood at the podium, palms sweating, eyes scanning the modest crowd. "I once believed wealth was proof of worth," she began. "I chased it through others. I lost myself. And when the empire I leaned on collapsed, I had nothing. I'm here to tell you it's possible to start over, to build not from greed, but from service." Her voice cracked, but applause followed. For the first time, Sophie didn't crave admiration. She craved sincerity. News reached Daniel weeks later. Isabella handed him a clipping from a local paper. Ex-wife of Richard Morgan speaks on rebuilding. A photo showed Sophie at the podium, plain dress, tired eyes, but a spark of authenticity. Daniel read in silence, then folded the article neatly. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He simply said, "People can change if they choose." By winter, Carter Systems struck an unprecedented compromise, an international oversight board staffed by regulators from 5 continents with transparency baked into its code. Markets stabilized. Protesters thinned. Daniel had bent without breaking, and in doing so, saved his empire. That evening, at a quiet dinner with Evelyn and Isabella, he raised a glass. To peace that bends but doesn't shatter. They clinked glasses, laughter lightening the air. Across town, Sophie walked home from the shelter, snowflakes catching in her hair. She carried no diamonds, wore no designer coat. Yet for the first time, She felt lighter than she had in years. Her life was small, modest, fragile, but it was hers built not on borrowed power, but on her own choices. She paused at a church window, candlelight flickering within, and whispered into the glass, "Thank you, Daniel, for teaching me what peace really means, even if I had to lose you to find it." The city pulsed around her, alive with neon and noise. Sophie stepped forward into the night, no longer chasing crowns, but carrying the quiet weight of redemption. The first snow of January fell heavy over Manhattan, softening the hard edges of the skyline. Inside his penthouse, Daniel Carter sat by the window glass of bourbon, untouched phone still in his hand. The call had ended an hour ago, yet the words refused to leave his ears. His mother Evelyn had passed quietly in her sleep. No headlines, no board meetings, no billion-dollar contracts could prepare him for the silence that followed. For years she had been his compass, the quiet voice reminding him that power without peace was hollow. Now her absence rang louder than applause ever had. He canceled meetings, ignored calls, left Carter Systems to run on autopilot, and retreated to Connecticut, where the house smelled faintly of tea and lavender. Reporters camped outside the gates, eager to capture the billionaire in mourning, but Daniel shut them out. He walked the creaking hallways alone, touching the empty chair where Evelyn once sat, the garden she once tended, the journals she left filled with notes about resilience and kindness. In those pages he realized she had never cared about his empire. She had cared about his humanity. The funeral was modest, just as she would have wanted. A handful of relatives, a scattering of colleagues, Isabella at his side. Cameras lined the street outside the chapel, but Daniel ordered them kept away. As the priest spoke of Evelyn's quiet strength, Daniel felt a weight heavier than any boardroom decision. He had built an empire to prove he wasn't a failure, yet now faced the truth that the only person he truly wanted to prove himself to was gone. When the service ended, he remained at the graveside long after the others left, snow melting against his coat, until Isabella finally touched his shoulder and whispered, "She'd want you to live, not just endure." Meanwhile, Sophie Morgan carried trays of food through the shelter's cramped dining room. Her life was small, now paychecks barely covering rent, nights spent studying, mornings folding donated clothes, but for the first time, she felt useful. The women she served did not care who she had once married or what scandals had burned her name across tabloids. They cared that she listened, that she showed up. One evening, the shelter director approached her with an envelope. "We've been asked to partner with Carter Systems' foundation," she said. Sophie's breath caught. "Daniel Carter." The director nodded. "They want to fund expansion, build classrooms, provide training. They asked if you'd speak at the press launch. Your story. It could inspire." Sophie froze. The thought of standing near Daniel again after everything terrified her, yet some part of her whispered that this was her chance not to reclaim him, but to prove she had changed. The day of the event, Daniel arrived in a dark suit, expression solemn but softened by grief. He spoke briefly about his mother, about her belief in second chances, and about why Carter Systems' wealth must fuel more than markets, it must fuel lives. Then the director introduced Sophie. Murmurs rippled through the room as cameras clicked, journalists recognizing her instantly. She stepped up to the podium, hands trembling, and for a moment she thought she might collapse under the weight of the past. But then she saw Daniel in the front row. Eyes steady, not cold, not warm, simply present. She drew a breath. "Once I believed money could fix emptiness. I was wrong. I lost everything chasing illusions. But I stand here not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that it is never too late to begin again. This shelter saved me as much as I try to serve others. And if my story can help one person choose resilience over despair, then my failures were not in vain." The room erupted in applause, some polite, some genuine. Sophie stepped back, heart racing, uncertain if she had just condemned herself or freed herself. Afterward, in the quiet of the corridor, Daniel approached. For a long moment they stood without words, the hum of cameras distant. Finally he said, "You spoke truth. That matters more than any empire." She swallowed, blinking back tears. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Daniel, only that you know I'm trying." He nodded, his grief-worn face carrying no judgment, only a kind of weary understanding. "Keep trying," he said, and then walked away, Isabella falling into step beside him. That night Daniel sat alone in Evelyn's study, her journals open across the desk. In her handwriting he read, "The measure of a man is not what he builds when watched, but what he tends in silence when no one cares." For the first time since his company rose, Daniel realized he had measured himself by headlines, valuations, and rivalries. Now, without his mother's steady voice, he felt a shift inside. Perhaps his empire was not the crown of his life, but the tool. Perhaps the true legacy was not power at all, but peace that could survive him. Across the city, Sophie returned to her apartment exhaustion heavy, but for once, her reflection in the cracked mirror did not disgust her. She had spoken, she had stood. She had faced Daniel without flinching. Redemption was not won in a day, but step by step. She whispered to the empty room, "I will keep going." The city pulsed outside, horns neon snow, melting into black asphalt. Daniel raised a glass to the skyline, not in triumph, not in grief, but in quiet acknowledgement. The empire was strong, but the man was learning that silence could hold more weight than crowns. Spring unfurled across Manhattan with deceptive gentleness, cherry blossoms dusting Central Park like a painter's careful strokes. But for Daniel Carter, the season carried weight sharper than any winter storm. Carter Systems had reached a valuation once reserved for myths. Trillions whispered on trading floors, his name spoken in the same breath as Rockefeller and Gates. The clearinghouse network spanned continents, governments reluctantly dependent, markets steady under its guard. Yet beneath the triumph lay a question he could no longer ignore. What did it mean to win the world if he lost himself? At the morning board meeting, analysts pitched acquisitions in Africa, expansion into digital identity partnerships with defense contractors. Numbers dazzled, charts climbed, but Daniel listened in silence, eyes on the city sprawling beyond the glass. When they finished, he spoke evenly. Power without restraint breaks. We will not become what we replaced. Uneasy glances crossed the table. Some wanted empire, others feared antitrust blades. Isabella studied him quietly, sensing the war inside him. Later in his office, she asked, "What do you want, Daniel, not the company?" "You." He hesitated. "Peace." But peace and empire rarely coexist. She touched his hand, firm but gentle. "Then you must choose which crown you're willing to carry." Meanwhile, Sophie Morgan walked the cracked sidewalks of Queens with a folder tucked under her arm. Inside were blueprints for a new community initiative, training programs for single mothers, funded partly by Carter Systems' foundation, partly by the city. The shelter director had asked Sophie to lead it, not because of her past, but because of her grit in rebuilding. For weeks, she had labored grants, logistics, volunteers. Now the project was ready, but approval depended on Carter Systems' final sign-off, which meant Daniel. The day of the pitch, Sophie stood in a modest conference room at Carter Systems headquarters, palms sweating, slides loaded on a borrowed laptop. Daniel entered, flanked by advisors, his presence still magnetic, his grief-tempered gaze quieter than in years past. Isabella sat beside him, legal pad ready. Sophie began, voice trembling at first, then steadying as she spoke of women clawing back dignity, of classrooms lit with possibility, instead of despair, of futures built not on borrowed wealth, but on skill. "I once believed the measure of life was diamonds and penthouses," she admitted, voice cracking. "I was wrong. The measure is whether we leave people stronger than we found them." Silence followed. Daniel leaned back, studying her not as an ex-wife, not as a ghost, but as a petitioner standing on her own terms. Finally, he said, "Approved, fully funded, and with one condition: transparency. No illusions." Sophie exhaled, nodding. No illusions. For the first time, their words aligned, not as lovers or enemies, but as builders of something larger than themselves. In the weeks that followed, the program took shape. Vacant warehouses became classrooms. Volunteers painted walls, hung lights, set up rows of second-hand computers. Sophie led from the front, hair tied back, hands speckled with paint, laughter echoing as she poured coffee for exhausted helpers. Journalists came not for scandal, but for a story of renewal. Headlines read, "From Scandal to Service, Sophie Morgan's Second Act." She clipped the articles not with vanity, but with humility, as proof that ashes could grow gardens. Daniel visited quietly one afternoon, no convoy, no press. He walked through the classrooms, watched women practicing spreadsheets, children coloring at side tables, Sophie kneeling to fix a loose wire. For a moment, he saw not the empire, not the battles, but the simple truth of lives touched. Sophie noticed him, rose, and offered a nod. No words, just acknowledgement. He left without ceremony, but inside something shifted. Perhaps this was the peace Evelyn had meant, the legacy not in towers, but in people. That night on his penthouse balcony, Daniel weighed two futures. One path, Global dominance governments bent to Carter Systems' headlines, screaming world's first trillionaire. The other restraint stewardship, a life measured not in power, but in impact. Evelyn's words haunted him still. The measure of a man is not what he builds when watched, but what he tends in silence when no one cares. He poured bourbon, the city glimmering beneath. Isabella joined him, her presence grounding. The crossroads, she said, softly reading his silence. He nodded. The crossroads. Across town, Sophie closed the shelter for the night, her hands raw from scrubbing floors. She stood alone in the darkened classroom, inhaling the scent of fresh paint and cheap coffee, and for the first time whispered, not regret, but gratitude. "I am not who I was," she told the empty room, and the silence, instead of mocking, seemed to agree. Manhattan pulsed with neon engines, laughter, and sorrow. Daniel stared at it all and realized the empire was his, but the choice of what to do with it would define not the world's story, but his own. The weight of crowns pressed heavy, but in the measure of silence, he heard faintly the possibility of freedom. Summer heat clung to Geneva as armored convoys rolled toward the glass and steel dome of the Global Economic Summit. Inside, world leaders, CEOs, and journalists filled the cavernous hall. Banners hung from vaulted beams, each bearing the summit's theme, the future of trust. At the center of it all sat Daniel Carter, the man the world alternately hailed as savior or condemned as threat. Carter Systems had become the nervous system of finance, its reach undeniable. Now, with cameras live across 5 continents, Daniel would face the question that would define him: empire or restraint. The Secretary General opened the session, his voice echoing under the dome. "Mr. Carter, your systems underpin trillions. Nations worry about sovereignty. Markets worry about monopoly. People worry about power unchecked. What do you intend to do?" Every lens swung toward him. Daniel rose slowly. Tailored suit, absorbing the spotlight, his eyes carrying the weight of Evelyn's last words. For a moment the hall was silent, but for the clicking of camera shutters. "Power without limits collapses," he said finally. "We've seen empires fall that way. Carter Systems will not follow that path. Today I announce the creation of a permanent international trust, the Carter Foundation, that will hold controlling shares of the company. Its board will be multinational, independent, transparent. My role will not be to rule finance, but to safeguard it with accountability baked into the core." Gasps rippled. Some applauded, some muttered. A senator leaned forward. "You're surrendering control." Daniel nodded. "I'm choosing peace. I will no longer measure my life by how much I can hold, but by how much I can let go." The chamber erupted, half in praise, half in suspicion. But Daniel's voice carried calm certainty. He had bent, and by bending, avoided the break. Back in New York, Sophie Morgan watched from a modest break room at the community center, eyes fixed on the live stream. She saw the man she had once mocked now stand not as a conqueror, but as something rarer, a builder willing to cede power. Around her, the women she mentored whispered, "That's him, the billionaire. He's giving it away." Sophie smiled faintly. "That's Daniel." Weeks later, Carter Systems' foundation launched its first global initiative education hubs in underprivileged cities. The board sought directors with both experience and redemption. To Sophie's shock, she received a call. "Would you serve as a regional coordinator for New York?" She almost refused, fearing whispers of nepotism. But the board insisted, "Your record at the shelter speaks louder than your past." On the day of the appointment, Sophie walked into Carter Systems headquarters, not as a wife, not as a ghost, but as a professional with a badge. She presented plans for training programs, childcare initiatives, micro-grants. Daniel sat across the long table, Isabella at his side, the foundation's directors flanking them. He listened quietly. No flicker of old wounds, no shadow of bitterness. When she finished, he simply said, "Approved. Welcome aboard." Their eyes met for a moment, not with longing, not with regret, but with a sober acknowledgement of parallel roads converging in service. Later that evening, Sophie stood outside the building, looking up at the skyline. She thought of the girl who once measured worth by diamonds and dinners, and the woman now carrying binders of community budgets. The contrast made her laugh softly through tears. For once, the city lights didn't mock her, they invited her. Across town, Daniel sat on his balcony, bourbon untouched. Isabella reviewing documents beside him. The summit had ended, The foundation was real, the empire secure yet shared. He thought of Evelyn, of her steady handwriting, and whispered into the night, "I've chosen peace." The city hummed back as if granting its approval. For Sophie, for Daniel, the paths of ruin and rebirth had twisted into something unexpected. Not reconciliation, not romance, but a shared horizon where empire and redemption both bent toward something greater. And in that bending, neither broke. Autumn returned to Manhattan with crisp air and long shadows across the skyline. The Carter Foundation had become more than a headline, it was an engine. Education hubs opened in Nairobi, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, and New York. Classrooms once dark now glowed with screens, libraries, and teachers funded by the empire Daniel had surrendered. For the world, it was a miracle of accountability. For Daniel, it was an echo of his mother's voice built not for crowns, but for silence. Yet with the empire no longer solely his, Daniel found himself adrift. Boardrooms once demanded his fire. Now they demanded his patience. Journalists begged for interviews about legacy, not vision. His days stretched with meetings he could delegate, his nights with thoughts he could not quiet. Isabella remained at his side, steady and warm. Yet even she saw the distance in his eyes. "You've built the future," she told him one evening as the city lights burned. "Now you must decide how to live in it." Daniel looked at her, at the skyline, at the bourbon he hadn't touched, and realized that power had given him purpose, but purpose had shifted. The man who once clawed at survival now had to learn to exist without the fight. Meanwhile, Sophie Morgan walked the halls of the New York Education Hub, her voice carrying above the chatter of children. She had become more than a coordinator. She was a leader, shaping programs, calming crises, mentoring women who reminded her of her younger self. At first, reporters came for the novelty. The ex-wife of Richard Morgan turned community advocate. But over time, the story shifted. Headlines began to read, "Director Morgan spearheads grassroots innovation." For the first time, her last name carried weight without scandal. In town halls and classrooms, people listened to her not because of who she had once married, but because of who she had become. One night, after a long day, she locked the center's doors, pausing in the cool evening air. A woman she had helped months earlier stopped her on the sidewalk. "You saved me," the woman said simply. Sophie shook her head, smiling through tears. "No, you saved yourself. I just held the light." That night she whispered to the cracked mirror in her modest apartment, "I'm not dust anymore." Months later, Daniel and Sophie crossed paths at the Foundation's annual summit. No sparks, no old wounds, just two lives bound by parallel redemption. On stage, Sophie spoke of dignity, resilience, and how second chances reshape more than the individual. They reshape the world. Daniel watched from the front row, not as an ex-husband, not as a rival, but as a witness to someone who had finally found her place. When she stepped down, he offered her a nod. She returned it. Nothing more was needed. Years passed. Carter Systems thrived under the stewardship of its foundation. Its power checked its reach steady. Daniel Carter grew older, his hair silver, his name etched not only in markets, but in textbooks, as the man who built an empire and then gave it away. In his final years, he lived quietly in Connecticut, tending Evelyn's garden, writing journals no one else would read. Isabella remained his partner, their days measured not by contracts, but by mornings of coffee and evenings of calm. When asked once in an interview what his proudest moment was, Daniel answered softly, "Not the deals, not the empire, the day I chose peace." Sophie Morgan continued to lead her work, touching thousands. She never reclaimed the glitz of her old life, nor did she want to. Her legacy became classrooms, families, and lives rebuilt. She was no longer the woman who traded love for diamonds. She was the woman who traded shame for service. And so the story of Daniel and Sophie did not end in reunion or revenge, but in something quieter, stronger, more lasting. They had walked through fire, through betrayal, through crowns and collapses, and emerged not as victors over each other, but as souls who had finally found their own peace. The city lights of Manhattan burned on, indifferent yet eternal, casting their glow over towers and tenements alike. For some, they were symbols of ambition, for others of loss. For Daniel and Sophie, they were reminders that power fades, wealth shifts, but the quiet crown of peace endures longer than empires.